Today is April 13th, 2018. We're going to explore some of the questions that people have sent me. I've asked for some questions, and some people in the family have sent me, and I'm going to explore them. And today, we're going to start with my childhood and some memories, and my memories of my parents as a child. Let's see where we get to.
Can you tell me something about your parents, where they came from originally?
It's interesting because that's not how a child thinks about their parents, right? Suddenly I found myself in some space with my parents around, and certainly you don't think about where they came from. So it's like looking back and from the inside and suddenly from the outside again. My father, Sioma, he was called Sioma by all the family. He took the name Robert when he came to America. And in France, he went by the name of Simon, as opposed to, as a sort of a play on Sioma. But the name he was given was Shlomo, Solomon. Back in Russia, where he was born in Odessa, and his parents were Russian, the traditional nickname for children who were called, or boys who were given the name Shlomo, was Sioma. I've even seen it in some books of literature, although I can't remember what they were. I remember being quite excited when I saw that because it sort of validated what I'd heard. Anyway, Sioma, how the name was pronounced back in Russia is not clear to me, but when they came to France, the French changed the hard G, so it must have been Trigger, or Trigger, something like that, to a soft G, Trigère. And it should have been, in terms of French grammar, the way it was spelled, T-R-I-G-E-R, it should have been Trigé, but they went to Trigère. And when the family, that is the family, my father, his sister, his mother, and his sister Pauline's husband and 2 children, when they arrived in America, somebody addressed him as Mr. Trigger, and he said, no, Trigère. And then he changed the spelling of his name. So the spelling as we know it now, T-R-I-G-E-R-E, is only since 1937 or whenever it is that he legally changed his name. His mother was Cecile. In Russia, among the family, she was called Tsipa. I suspect that her Hebrew name was Tzipora, and which is a traditional match with Cecile or Cecilia or something of that nature. And her maiden name was Corinne, back in Russia spelled K-O-R-I-N or C-O-R-I-N. When they came to France, those who still had the name spelled it Corinne, as a French person would, C-O-R-E-I-N-E. And but she also went by Trigère because she was married to Alexander Trigère. Alexander was called by his family and friends Zis, or meaning Zeus or sweet, probably. But his full name was Alexandre Trigère. And Alexander and Cyrus were names that Jews chose out of their usual dictionary of Hebrew names to honor 2 non-Jews who were good to Jews over the centuries. Alexander the Great, and was he an emperor, or King Cyrus of Persia? Anyway, that was him, and he died in France in 1931. He was, I'd say, in his 50s. I'd have to look at the math again. I want you to know that there are family trees all done. I did them at the time when I was looking for a name for Rachel, and I had already Sarah. That was an obvious one, how I got her name. But Rachel was a little more obscure. Rachel turns out to be my father's grandmother. She is the wife of the Shlomo that my father is named for. This is his other grandfather up here, but not the Shlomo one. My mother is born in Virginia, in Roanoke, Virginia, from a Protestant middle-class family. Her mother had been a school teacher before she married. Her father became, I guess he was a teacher, and then he became a superintendent of schools. And when he retired from that, he actually ended up representing the alcohol lobby or something, which I don't quite know what to make of. Anyway, they were Southerners, and she was a very bright student, and she was their eldest. And they had two other children. One was named Sarah, and one was named Henry. And my mother's name was Jane. She had a middle name of Sidner. I don't remember why. I mean, but I have family trees for that too, so we can go back and look. And she wanted to go to school. Her sister Sarah died at age 6 or so of, I think, leukemia. And her younger brother, Henry, lived until his late 50s or early 60s. And he had 5 children.
What was her mother's maiden name and her family name and her
Oh,
parents' names?
Oh, right. So her last name was Ellis, and her father was Henry, and her mother was Jane. And if you look at the family tree, it was really almost shocking to me when I discovered that I was the 5th Jane in a row on that side of the family. So you can guess from this side of the family was not Jewish, since Ashkenazi Jews traditionally don't name their children after living relatives, but after people who have died in order to commemorate them, to honor them. And my father's side of the family were Jews who were not observant, but certainly identified as Jews.
How far back can you trace your mother's family in terms of coming over to America and the South? And were they involved in the Confederacy even?
Oh yes, they were in Confederacy. I have a picture here of a Captain Hawkins. Captain Hawkins, that would have been my grandmother's side of the family. Her father, actually. And he was a captain in the Civil War. This is Virginia. This is not the Deep South. It's a little different. But it's definitely the Confederacy. They came over. I didn't do the family tree, but there are members of this family who relished doing family tree stuff, one of which was my grandmother. And I have all her work. You'll see it all.
And you can trace them back to the 17th century, coming
Yeah,
over?
somebody, Ellis, 1600.
So here you have your father in Paris, coming from Odessa, from a generation of tailors. Can you tell us about that?
Oh yes, his father was a bespoke tailor, and that means you're making some clothes for somebody. You're not producing them for a store. You're making it for a particular individual. So you have to build your clientele, probably word of mouth. You know, oh, I have a good tailor for you. What's his name? Alexander Trigger. Trigère, whatever they said. And there you go. And my father did not follow in that. My Monsieur Léon, we called him Monsieur Léon all my life, but it's Leon Henlein. He was another Russian Jew, tailor, who worked for my grandfather. My grandfather, as I said, died young, and Léon stayed with the family as a family friend, let's say. I think he was in love with my grandmother. Whether she was in love with him, I don't know. But he came also to America, followed, and worked in the family business that was then not my grandfather's and my grandmother's, but my father's and my aunt, his sister. They started a family business. So he was a tailor. Oh, and my grandmother also had a shop for a while. I have a picture someplace of her, and it says, she shared the shop name with somebody, but I don't think it says Trigère, I think it says Corinne, which is kind of interesting. And she was a dressmaker. So Pauline, my aunt, grew up with pins and needles all over the place. The fact that my father chose not to be a tailor is the more interesting part. He wanted to be a businessman, and he finished the lycée and went to some business kind of college, some credentialing or something. And I have no evidence of that or no information to give you, except hearing him say it, or hearing somebody say it about him. And he ended up in the dress business, but on the business end of it. He worked for other people for a while, and in fact, right facing you in that room is the hanger. You see the hanger there? Yeah, you hand me the hanger. This is evidence, solid evidence. This is my father became a partner of somebody named Maguet. It says Trigère Maguet. Trigère spelled the original way without the last E. And then it says Paris. By the way, I have a wonderful hanger collection. I think hangers are really interesting. They are unobtrusive. No one thinks about them much. They hang in our closets, not hidden, but under coats and clothes, and they stay there forever. And then they move with us when we go someplace new, or sometimes they get left behind. And then the next people who move into that house suddenly have a hanger with some ad from some company in Nebraska. And, it's a dry cleaners. You often have dry cleaners have their advertising on hangers. But you also have dressmakers and designers and stuff like that. So, and also they tend to be designed interestingly. My collection has a lot of interesting odd ones. And they stand-ins for human beings. You see? There's even a little face here. And it has shoulders, just like me. A little bit like a chair is the same way. A chair is built the way it is because I'm built the way I am. If my knees didn't bend in that direction, the chair would be designed in a completely different way. A chair has a back. Sometimes it has arms. It has a seat, just like me. It has legs. It has 4. I have 2. But it has all the parts of the body that I have. And if you take a wire hanger, sometimes, you see that one up there, Ken? This is this is making the point I'm trying to say, which is that, can you see it?
Yes.
Here's the head, which corresponds to this part. And then I've turned her into a lady.
It's hard to see.
It's hard to see. Okay, we'll find another occasion to show her off.
Can you go back to your grandparents? Can you describe what you know of their personalities? What your grandfather was like and your grandmother? What do you know about them at all in terms of what they were like with other people and in their relationship? Can you surmise anything about them?
Well, there are two sets of grandparents, right? So
Let's talk about the French ones.
I personally know nothing of Alexandre. He was gone way before I was dreamt of. All I know from somebody is that he had a temper. But I think one of the reasons I'm doing these tapes is how little is remembered or known about people who have gone. And if all you know is what one person said, oh, she had a temper, that's unfortunate. It's kind of sad. I mean, really, nobody only has that as one trait. And I do have an anecdote about, I think it was from Pauline who told me this. She took him, on Yom Kippur, she took him to the back of some kosher restaurant he knew was open in the back. You could go in the back. It was closed to the public because it was Yom Kippur. But you could go in the back and get something to eat. And he knew that. And she went with him. So I thought that was kind of an amusing little detail. I don't have too many, but I'm uncovering some material now in my archive room. And I found some stuff in my grandfather Alexander's handwriting. So I will have uncovered some interesting stuff, I hope. It's letters. So from the letters, wow, from letters you get a lot, especially if you have more than one. My grandmother, his wife, was one of these people I would call a peacemaker. For those of you who know Lily Besterman, she was a peacemaker. Still, come on, let's not fight, that kind of thing.
Shalom Babayit.
Shalom Babayit, right. And I remember staying over with her when I was a child. I don't remember how old.
Cecile.
Cecile, yes. The apartment I remember her in was one on Central Park South, 120 Central Park South. It was first my father's apartment, then it became Cecile's, then it became Jean-Pierre's. And finally it left the family. I don't know who has it. I have these funny flights of fantasy where I go back and buy up the apartments where my family lived. I suggested it to Shatai the other day. 1326 Madison Avenue. Go take a look. It's a nice apartment.
How about Fifth Avenue?
Fifth Avenue, 1140 Fifth Avenue. This was a nice apartment too. I'd be eager to go look at it because that apartment had a lot of beautiful built-in things. The closets were wonderful. And why would anybody destroy wonderful closets? They must be identical.
Tell me about Cecile and going to visit her and your memories.
Oh, yes. Oh, no. I would stay overnight and we would watch the $1 Million Movie. Was that every night of the week? I don't know. But I can still hear the music of the yeah, that's it. That was the theme music of the $1 Million Movie. And I would sleep in the sofa bed in the living room. And sometimes she would serve borscht. And she had this wonderful closet, which my father must have made. It was in the dining corner area. The kitchen was a little tiny galley kitchen. And facing the dining corner, right next to the kitchen, was a series of closets. My father was a lover of closets. Everywhere he went, he created closets. And I only knew it as her closets, but I think they must have been his first. So you would open it up, and inside would be, the back would be a mirror, I think. It's a place to keep your toiletries and whatnot, and then drawers and stuff like that. And I remember opening that, and I can remember the smell of her talcum powder. And occasionally I'm in some public setting where you smell and you think, wow, you know, that's my grandmother's talcum powder.
Would you speak to her in French when you were with her? I know she spoke Russian, of course, and Yiddish, but what language would you speak
I
to your
didn't
grandmother?
speak Russian or Yiddish.
I know that. Would you speak to her in French?
Yeah, her English was not so great. Her French was also an immigrant's French. I mean, she moved as an adult with a child to France.
Where did she come from?
She came from Kiev area, but her last residence was in Odessa. Her husband left earlier, set up a business, and then she came I don't know how much longer later. And so my father, Stjoma, was 3. I have a picture of them here. This is in Russia. That's my father, that's my grandmother. I can't remember who that is. The Tanta Gusta, I think. And so he was 3 or so when he came from Russia. And Pauline is 7 years younger than him. So 4 years later they had, I went and found that apartment, by the way. That was fun. Can I tell that story? I was staying with Renee, who's my father's first cousin, Renee Kaufman, and it's in the 9th arrondissement, and she said, well, this is where we lived. I mean, she was now, as an older lady, living in the same neighborhood she grew up in. I had not even thought of that. She said, we lived at, and I frankly can't remember where she lived. So, my grandmother had a sister, Rose, and her husband was a furrier. And so the 2 sisters lived a couple blocks away from each other, and their children would run back and forth between the 2 homes. You know, somebody needed something, and the other one had it, so one of the kids would be sent with the package. So I said, they lived around here? She said, yes. She gives me the address. And it's a funny thing, if you don't ask these questions, some people just never think to tell you because it doesn't occur to them that it would interest you. I didn't ask. She said, yes, well, they lived around the corner. Where? I asked. She gives me the address, which I can't roll off my tongue, but I could find it again. And I go, and I actually filmed my walk from one place to the other. And I held the camera down low, as if I were a kid, as if this and this made such a big difference. But I get to the place, and it's one of these portes cochères, that these are doors for coaches. You know, open up and you can go in with your coach and horse. And it's closed and it's locked. And so I back up and I go across the street and I just watch it for a while. And I see some people have a code, they're punching in, and they go in. And I can even see a little bit in. The whole door doesn't open. It's a door for a human that's within the door for the car or coach. And so I decide that I'm going to sneak in with the next person that goes in, which I do. And I find myself stuck between the door I've just gone through and a big gate. So now I'm in a lobby, closed area, a big rectangular cube, and I'm looking at the courtyard. And Renee told me they had the cheapest apartment in the building, which was on the ground floor at the end of the courtyard. So I have to think, why would that be the cheapest? Then I really thought about it a long time. French big buildings apartment buildings don't have windows at street level. you're walking by this big entrance, for instance. There's an entrance, but there are no windows on the walls on the left and the right. So anybody who is living at that floor only has windows onto the courtyard, not onto whatever street is available. Whereas if you're up one floor, you have windows onto the courtyard and onto the street, and etc. as far as the building will go. And presumably higher up is a little more pleasant because you're not hearing so much of the noise from the street or smells or whatever. So I'm looking in, I'm stuck in this closed area, and I'm looking through a gate at the apartment at the other end of the courtyard. And finally a guy comes in from outside. He's got his bicycle, and he asks me if he can help me. And I explained to him the story. He said, "Oh, come on in with me. I live there." He said, you want to come in and see?" Yes, was what I blurted out. So we're walking, him with his bicycle and me with my camera, and we're walking to the end, and he explains to me that the apartment got cut in half, and he has only half now, and that's another person's apartment. And we walk into his apartment, and it's nothing to write home about. It's kind of dark. There's no interesting features. And I'm realizing this was the cheapest apartment. And in fact, if they made it into 2 apartments, who knows how they cut it up. Nothing was authentic from that period anymore. Until I turned around and looked out the window at the courtyard. It was the same window. Maybe it wasn't the same glass, but it was the same window, frame, the whole thing. They hadn't changed that. And suddenly I was looking at the view that my family looked at, because that hadn't changed much either. I was looking at their view. I took a picture. I found it a very moving moment. I brought an artwork I made. Let me explain. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
This is a self-portrait. This is my face and my former glasses. And behind me is my face without the glasses, about 1.5 inches space between them. And hanging, it's not hanging now, it's up, I've got it leaned back, so I'm going to make it hang properly in a second. But there are 3 little objects hanging there, and they are windows. Actually, one of them is a picture of this wall, and the others are all different kinds of windows. And right now, visible right there, is the window that I'm talking about. And what came to mind, now I'm going to make it move, these 3 objects of windows are hanging by, well, it's not a thread, they're hanging by a hair, and it's actually my hair. So it's very tenuous. And I've set it up so that these objects before my eyes can move. They don't move quite as much as I'd like them to, but you can see that, right? That they dangle. We see the world through our own lens, through our own. We frame things the way we frame things. So windows have frames, and glasses, eyeglasses, have frames and lenses, and windows are lenses onto the world. And I guess it's a metaphor for how we perceive and understand the world around us. And that perception I got at that moment in that apartment when I turned around and I saw the world through a window. That was the only connection I had to this family's experience in Paris.
You have fond memories of your grandmother. She was the
Oh
only...
yeah, I shared a room with her when we visited Pauline. Now we're back in New York, right? Pauline bought herself a country house, and it became a sort of family focus, and we'd all go out on weekends. I wasn't there year-round, but during the time of the year that I was, I would visit my grandmother, of course, and I would tag along. I'd be part of some pickup system of carpooling.
From New York City.
Yes, somehow I remember Pauline and her friend Julio driving, and I remember driving with Jean-Pierre, and I remember driving with my father. But it was always different people, and my grandmother was often along. I remember being in the back seat, in the center back seat of some vehicle, and falling asleep on the way to the country and waking up. I mean, we've all experienced this, I think. You wake up when the air changes, it's cooler, it's the country, the roads. We're off the highway, suddenly the driving changes, and that's just when that's enough to wake you up, and you know you're now in the country. And I shared a room with my grandmother. We had like twin beds, and it was wonderful. And then one day, Pauline redid her mother's room and redesigned it, and there was no extra bed for me. I now had to take a bed upstairs there was a sort of a living room, big living room area, and then there was a bedroom. And if my cousin would get the bedroom, and I would get one of these two benches along the windows in the big living room area upstairs. So there was no privacy. So I guess it's a loss of intimacy. I lost my grandma. I wanted to say also, I loved her bedroom. She had in her bedroom back
This is in the city.
in the city. She had what are those beds called where there's it's like a sofa chair, but it's long, a chaise longue. In French it's a chaise longue. But her bedroom had a bed, a chaise longue, and her fabulous desk. And her fabulous desk, after she died, came to my father, and now it's in Gun's apartment someplace in California. And it was just a big, wonderful desk that would open up like this. I don't even know how to describe it. But I remember once seeing the sewing machine set up on the desk. So that reminds me, I mean, she was a seamstress, right? And yet I never saw her making anything. By the time I knew her, she wasn't making anything. She told me once how she'd shown me her thumb was damaged because a needle had gone through the nail or something awful. So she knew how to use a sewing machine, but didn't teach me. I saw my mother once in Argentina using a sewing machine. She made herself a dressing gown, I think. But she didn't teach me. No one taught me how to use a sewing machine. When I went off to college, my father asked me what kind of gift I would like. I said I'd like a sewing machine. So we went shopping for a sewing machine, but not at Sears. I don't know where it was, but I got that wooden case sewing machine, which I took off to college. And I taught myself how to use a sewing machine. And the plastic one I have now, which I bought at Sears, was I bought in my first 2 years of marriage in Cambridge, up on Mass Avenue. That's the one I still have today.
Speaking about figuring out how to work a sewing machine, you have a facility with your hands and
Are
your
we going
mind.
off of the family now for a bit?
For a moment. You have a facility with your hands and your mind in figuring out how things work and how things fit
I have
together?
no idea why I have that. I just thought everybody had the same set of skills or non-skills that I had. It never occurred to me that people have different skill sets. I just figured things out. I'm good spatially. I wouldn't say I'm a very good seamstress, by the way. I can figure things out, but I've never really worked from a pattern. Really never. Not from a paper pattern. No one's ever shown me how to do that. I did make myself a shirt once, which I still have. What I did was to take apart another shirt and use that as the pattern. But so unused to sewing am I, is that I often make mistakes and then I spend an inordinate amount of time fixing it, figuring out how to cover up my mistake. So I'm clever about things, but I'm not trained as a seamstress.
Let's get back to your family now. Your family lived in Paris. From around 1905, your father came to Paris, till about 1936. Do I have that right?
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, your father was traveling around Paris, around France.
Even in North Africa.
What was he doing exactly?
He was, I'm trying to put the pieces together. He was, as I showed you that hanger, he was a partner with somebody, but then he became a partner with his sister and brother-in-law. And this is like the untold history. Because Pauline likes to say that she just started like Athena out of Zeus's head in New York, but in fact they were working in Paris. And they were working, the three of them, together. And her husband, Lazar, was also a Russian tailor. And not somebody her parents wanted her to be with, it seems.
She married young.
She married young. And according to her, he had a temper. So, which makes me think of how do we avoid falling into the same temperature bath water. If Alexandra had a temper, and that's all we sort of know, I mean, that's not all there is to know, right? Okay, never mind. We all get the point, right?
He was traveling around North Africa.
So Lazar Radley, Razinski, they came to America as Razinski, Pauline Razinski. In fact, I have some documents right here on the table about the entry into the United States. He was the tailor. She was making designs. And my father was going around selling them to the different stores in France and North Africa. And he would go around, and he was the only one who knew how to draw. Pauline never knew how to draw. Although I think she could manage, but she just would, the facility was not in drawing. But my father did, and he could sketch things that he saw. And I have some letters where he's showing the details, the seams, where the buttons are, how the cut looks on a coat that he saw, that he thought was very attractive. So basically, copying somebody else's design.
So let's say he would go into a big town in France. Would he bring a dress or a pattern with him to this shop or big store? And they would say, yes, I'd like 6 of those. Do you have any sense of how that worked?
I don't know how it worked there, but he wouldn't be going with a pattern. He would be going with the actual item, I think. Because that's how it was in America when they started out. And those red cases, what did we call them? Those trunk shows. He would do trunk shows. So I'm assuming it was something like that in France. I mean, where would the Americans get the idea from? It had to be the same system. You would travel with your collection. The trunks, I have one downstairs. They're the length of an average dress and the width of a person, and they're this thick. And you just pile it up with the clothes, not folded up, but lying flat so that there are fewer wrinkles. And then you open it up wherever you end up, and there's somebody in the store to help you iron something out, and there may be a store model who will put the clothes on and show it to the buyer. That's the way it was in America. So my father would go to all these big department stores all over the country and do trunk shows. After a while, Pauline would go and do the trunk shows as well. And then the designer is there, so wow, you know.
Would you describe your father and how he attired himself?
Oh, this is my father up here. He was elegant. Elegant. He was tall. He must have been 6 foot, 6'1", and slender and charming and attractive. He was a ladies' man. He was not married. I often joke that probably helped in selling the clothes. He was probably the buyers were often women. So, you know, charm will get you someplace. There's no doubt about it. And he told me that he always was working on getting rid of his French accent. And I said, I don't think so. I think first of all, it's not going to happen. And second of all, it's an asset. So here was this tall, attractive, single Frenchman. And he dressed fabulously. His clothes were bespoke. His shirts were made for him. And, you know, he had these fabulous closets. I'd really like to get back into the Fifth Avenue apartment and see those closets again. And the library.
You called him.
But you got to put beautiful clothes in those closets, and they were.
You called him Papa, is that right?
Papa, that's the traditional way you would call a father if you were French. And the name we chose for him as a grandfather was Papi, P-A-P-I, which was a traditional French grandfather name. Mamie and Papi would be the equivalent.
So your father comes over to America with his family around 1936 or so, enters America through Detroit, and they are on their way to South America, because that's where the fortune, he'd been there himself, or Lazar had been there.
Lazar had been there.
And that was where they thought they were going to Peru or Ecuador or something like that.
You know, I hear different stories. When I go through all the papers, I may find the evidence of what the plan really was.
On the way, they go to New York, and what happens in New York?
Well, they're visiting relatives. There's some relatives in Detroit. And I think they come in through Detroit because they're coming in through Canada. And then when they decide they're going to stay, they have to go out and come back in. I don't know how difficult that was. Anyway, they'd gone to visit New York. Their relatives were in New York as well. You know, Sioma had been there earlier, had been in New York earlier. I have evidence of that. I have letters he's written. Merciless letters about being sick in some cousin's apartment, and the amount of talking that's going on, and his judgment. It's amusingly written, but it's unkind judgment about the lack of taste of the people around him. So he had explored New York, and I'm a little confused on this. It never occurred to me way back to ask him any of this stuff. So they come to New York, and then now starts the problem of stories that become myth.
Or legends.
Yeah, and it's really problematic because you get a good story and you amplify it, and now it gets written about in the newspaper or someplace, and then that's the story. So after a while, Pauline would say that they left France to avoid Hitler, but that was not at all the plan. That it was not. in any of the discussions of what they were doing. All the other relatives stayed in France. And
Who were those relatives?
okay, so there's that Tante Renée that I mentioned before, their first cousin, Sioma and Pauline's first cousin, and her brother, Sioma Boris, also named Sioma, but he had this Russian first name also, so he was called Sioma Boris, or Sioma le Petit and Sioma le Grand. My father was Sioma le Grand, Sioma the Tall, and the other one was Sioma the Short. So it wasn't nice. Anyway, those were first cousins, and they were the children of Rose and George Wexler, Rose Corinne and George Wexler. Those were the only cousins that were in France. And Sioma Boris married another woman named Renée, and they were both doctors, and they had 3 children called Paulette, Micheline, and Bertrand. Micheline and Bertrand are still alive. Paulette died of cancer a while ago. She has 1 son, Florent, and he's got, I think, 3 children. I've lost track of him. Florent Demay, D-E-M-A-Y. His father was a doctor also. Paulette was lovely. I remember her. Micheline was sort of cut off from the rest of the family by her, I don't know, their personalities. I don't know exactly what the issue was, but she sort of went her own way. She was an English teacher.
In Versailles.
And she ended up living in Versailles. But, and she married and divorced, and she has 2 sons, whose names escape me right now. And their last name is Legras. So these are non-Jews that they've all married. And Legras is the fat, or the fatty, or the whatever. And then there's Bertrand, who's still around. I Skype with him a little bit. He became a doctor. He married a doctor, Janine, I don't know what her maiden name is, but Janine Wexler. And they have 2 sons, Patrice and Arnaud, who are both now married and have, I think, 2 children each. And so there are basically no more Jews left in the family in France. My grandfather, Alexander, recently Rachel has asked me a lot of questions about this, or I explained it. Alexander had a first cousin whose name was Nathan. No, that's his brother, Nathan Trigger, who had 2 children. One of them named Shlomo, and the other one named Rachel. After the grandparents the grandmother that I named, my father's grandmother through his father's side was Rachel, and the grandfather was Shlomo. So he was named after that grandfather, and I named Rachel after my father's grandmother, Rachel. Those people are Alexander and Nathan, and there are others in the family, their parents. So my grandfather, Alexander's brother, he has 2 children. I think I've got this right, yeah. Shlomo and Rachel. Rachel stays in Russia, but Shlomo goes to Palestine, or what is the British Mandate, in, I don't know exactly, let's say 1919. And he goes to the kibbutz.
Which kibbutz?
Kfar Giladi. And I don't think he's one of the founders. I'm not positive. I don't think so, no. The kibbutz was founded in 1917. So I don't know when he showed up there. Right. So Shlomo marries Leah and has 2 children. And the one who survived is Tamar, Tamar Meron, who was married to Moshe Meron, and a son who I'm embarrassed to say right now. I've lost the name. I can't remember it, but I have it in my records. And he died in a battle.
1956 war.
Yeah, and in the Suez. And then he marries Temi, and they have Yudit. And Yudit is
Living on the kibbutz.
she's still on the kibbutz, and she has 2 children. Anyway, that's to link up this Russian French stuff connection over to Israel and the kibbutz, and that's how you have those relatives there. Rachel's son, this woman who stayed in Russia, she married a guy named Rabinkin, and her son is Natan Rabinkin, named after Anatol Rabinkin, and he married and had 2 children who now live in the Boston area, and I think he's still around. And I met them in Israel, and then they left Israel and came to America. All right, that wraps up that group. So, but my father and the rest of the family were coming in from France. They visited New York. Who were they visiting? Again, another one of my grandmother's siblings. He was no longer around. Also named, he was named Zalman. And he moved to America years earlier and married and had children. I think he had 4 daughters or 3 daughters and a son. And the son ended up working for the Trigers. So all of this is on the family tree, and I grew up with them, but not really. We didn't mix socially with them, except for my grandmother. And after my grandmother died, I think that was basically the end. Although you could see the first cousin resemblance between my father and his cousin. My father was very tall, the cousin was very short. Here I am forgetting a name again. And this is only going to get worse, this forgetting of names, I'm afraid.
We can make them up.
No, we're not going to make them up. Jack Corinne. So he's got the same name because Zalman is the male. He keeps my grandmother's maiden name. So Jacques Corinne marries Betty, and there's a whole bunch of people. And it was at Betty's and Jack's that my father was sick and writing about people talking too much and the awful taste.
Would you say
It
your
was a
father
snobism.
was he an aristocrat kind of?
He was pulling rank in terms of
Sophistication.
aesthetics. Yes, aesthetics and sophistication. He was also extremely well-read and self-taught. He was erudite in his own things that he chose to be well acquainted with. And in fact, it was one of the things that he had in common with my mother, because they really had nothing in common. He married her, she had 2 children, and so he was going to be the gallant gentleman and, take care of this person. What they had in common was literature and a love of language.
Let's see how they got together. So your mother grew up in Roanoke. She went to school. She went to high school.
She was the valedictorian of her class, and she wanted to go to Barnard College. Absolutely no, say her parents. You're going to, I don't know, some Southern girls' school. And Goucher, probably, yeah. And she gets her way. I don't know how she does it, but she gets her way, and she ends up in Barnard, up north in New York City. And you know, it was the wrong place to send their daughter, and they knew it. And goodness, they were right. So she meets up with all the bright young people of her time, who at that period, if you were thinking right and you had your brain screwed on right, you were probably a young communist, because that's what you did if you were clever and bright and
Concerned about the world.
and concerned about the world, but you actually didn't have to pay the price for it. The way in the 60s you were on marches, right? This was that period.
So she's in Barnard, and what happens?
Oh, she falls in love with this young man. They both go to work one summer, I think, at a home for adult retarded people. We once, years as a young girl, I went there. We went to visit. I couldn't tell you where it is except someplace in northern New Jersey. And she gets pregnant.
Is he a Columbia student?
He's a Columbia student. He is the son of Polish immigrants. His father's a tavern keeper.
And what's his last name?
I'm not sure how it was pronounced exactly, Morshovsky or something like that. And he changes it eventually to Morrow, M-O-R-R-O-W. But here she is in love with a Polish lower class person and a Catholic. Oy vey,
As they would say in Virginia.
as they would not say in Virginia. And their daughter gets pregnant at Barnard. The mother goes up to take care of things. She drops out of college. She has the baby. And I don't know exactly what happens next, but he, the father of this baby,
Edward Morrow.
Edward Morshevsky, is off fighting with in Spanish, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. So he's not even around when the baby is born, and she has a proxy marriage. Somebody stands in. That's the way they did it then, so that the baby is has married parents, although the father's not around. So I can't imagine what it was like. He comes back, and somehow or other, they make their life. He's graduated from college, and I don't know at what point, but he becomes a reporter for the New York Times. But I don't know when that happened.
And you happen to have all the correspondence between them during the Spanish Civil
Oh
War.
yeah, I have the letters, the love letters between these two people. And I'm going to deposit it it took me a while to figure out what to do with it. Ken helped me figure it out. There's a special collections at NYU for the Spanish Civil War. I'm going to make copies and deposit the originals there. Somebody will find them interesting and useful for their studies.
So he comes back and he's a reporter for the...
I don't know exactly. He must have...
But during the war, wasn't he in Poland?
No, that's later.
Later, sorry.
Yeah,
He comes back.
Spanish Civil War is in the 30s.
Right. He
Comes back, and they actually have another child. My sister, who's now 75, that's her. She gets given the name Helena Jacqueline. The boy gets creatively named Edward Andrew Morrow III. Or no, Jr., sorry. And he gives his child the name Edward Andrew Morrow III. Continuing the long tradition of, what should we call it, non-creative name giving. Let's name him after me. Sorry, Andy. Anyway, Helena named, nicknamed Laney, is named after her aunt. And I'm named after my aunt. So she's named after Helena, her father's sister, Helena Dow, married Dow. And I'm named after Pauline, Sioma's sister, and my mother. So I'm given the name Pauline Jane. The non-creative name giving. I put myself in that category. But I'm always called Janie, never Pauline. And after college, I dropped it because I realized I was just not using it. I never changed it in some legal way, but all my legal papers, my passport, my social security, none of that mentions Pauline. So I guess if you do it early enough and consistently enough, I'm known as this, and that's who I am.
Didn't one of our daughters change her name also? From one name to another?
Who?
Sarah?
Oh, well, we're not there yet.
Okay, but it just reminds me that the name changing seems to be part of
Well, Lainey started using Jackie for a while when she was in, I think, nursing school. And my brother was always called Andy until his father died and he went out into the world and he called himself Ed. And I was always called Janie, and when I went out into the world I was called Jane. And when I chose to become a Jew, and not a half Jew, I chose the Hebrew name Hannah. And when I went to live in Israel, I was called Hannah. So, people do change their names, including one of my daughters. Both my daughters changed their names for a while. Anyway, we'll get to that. We're talking about the past. You asked me how they met.
Right.
So at one point, so now this really very bright woman has no undergraduate degree, my mother. And she now has 2 children, and she's living someplace in Manhattan. And I'll have to ask my brother, maybe he has some memory of where they lived. And they got divorced.
But does Ed goes to fight in the Second War, I assume.
I assume also.
And then he stays in Poland after the war. When did they get divorced, though?
I don't know that information. My sister's 75 now. She's born in, what, 42 or something like that?
Correct.
Okay. So sometime after that. I don't know when. Okay. So she's now, okay, so now remember the grandparents down in Virginia. She went up north, she got pregnant, she dropped out of college, she married this Polish Catholic lower class fellow, and now she's divorced. So basically she's giving them a run for their money, you know. She's the black sheep. She's taking on the mantle of the black sheep and doing a terrific job at it.
What we used to call the School of Parnassus.
Not in Virginia. So she's now working at some point for the Wool Bureau. Whatever that means, I have no idea. Something to do with writing words and doing...
Not sheep shearing.
No, the Wool Bureau. You know, this is where they... promoting wool products, or I don't know, so not merchandising, marketing and stuff like that. She's working there, and she has a friend working with her named Helen Solomon. And Helen Solomon is married to Ed Solomon. And they, for reasons that I am trying hard to remember, they know my father. How do they know my father? Wow, I don't know. But they introduce the 2 of them. And now I have some stories from my brother, who tells me that my mother was going out with 2 different fellows, that he preferred one who was in the army and who carried a gun and who was very dashing. And he did not prefer my father, who looked older, because he was, and he wore a long dark coat and a hat and was, I don't know, he probably looked like a European spy or something. And wasn't as fun, the fun part being that the gun actually went off in the apartment once. If you're a little boy, I guess that's kind of exciting. And my mother, our mother, explains to him that Sioma will be a better provider for them. So she marries him, and she marries him in the Solomon's household. Solomon, although the name sounds like they might have been Jewish, they were not. Oh, I know, he was teaching at Sarah Lawrence College for a while. But that doesn't quite explain why my father knew him. I don't know how that happened. They had a child at about the same time I was born, named Grant Solomon. And I have pictures of me with this boy as babies. And then I have a picture of me walking with Helen Solomon when I was going off to school at Sarah Lawrence College. Ed did not teach there anymore. He had gotten a job at Solomon, working at Morningside Heights.
Community council? Or?
Community council, yeah, and community relations or something like that. And he and his organization hired Larry Besserman. And Barney Weinberg worked for him. So that's how this whole other group of, so it's all connected somehow. It's vaguely amusing, the connections, you know. It's like moving pieces on a chessboard. Like, why are you moving there? Well, you'll see. There's going to be a reason.
So here your mother's working for the Wool Bureau, and your father's out selling.
No, he's got his business and he's successful.
And he's marketing clothing. He's marketing.
Yeah, he's the main salesperson for the company. They started their business in '42. So I don't know how far along this was. Oh, I do know. They were married in '47. So they were doing okay. And I'm born in '48. And he did what you're supposed to do from his friends, is you move out to the suburbs. So the first place that my mother and the two kids in Sioma lived was in his apartment at 120 Central Park South. And it wasn't big enough for a family with children already. And so they moved out to Dobbs Ferry. Why there? Because they had a friend named Jacques and Janet Artel who lived in the vicinity. And that's a whole other story. Jack worked for, he was a textile company representative, and he was a Russian Jew who had this unbelievable story. He and his brother left Russia with their mother, went to Paris, and the mother went back because she heard the father was ill. She left her boys, who were like 12 and 14, someplace, and never was able to come back for them. And they had to fend for themselves through Europe, through World War II, and ended up in America. And their story is unbelievable.
They were in a German prisoner of war camp.
Well, one of them was, anyway. And these were people who spoke Russian, Yiddish, French, and eventually beautiful English. So there's a parallel to my father. And they also married two American, non-Jewish women, very attractive, younger women.
Didn't your father say?
Oh, yeah, I saw a letter that I do not have, but I read it in France, in Renee's apartment. It was a letter he sent, and it said, announcing I'm marrying America. It's an interesting idea. Anyway, that wasn't a marriage made in heaven. You can't make a marriage just based on loving literature. It just doesn't quite work. And, but I was born, and my brother and my sister and I went in the early 90s or late 80s. We went to visit the house that we all moved to in Dobbs Ferry, that they remembered and I didn't, and that's a whole other wonderful story. So there's a theme of going back to see the houses, and I sometimes, and in this case also, get to see the inside of these places. Before the 120 Central Park South apartment, all the family lived at 1326 Madison Avenue. And they shuffled in and out of that apartment. And the last resident alone was my father. And the phone number was Atwater 98155. And they were in that apartment from 1937 until my father moved to Fifth Avenue, which was, I'm not quite sure. I have to pull that one to do some math there. I would think I moved to that apartment when I was 11 or 12. So, if I'm born in 48,
So late
19,
58, 59, 60,
no, before, yeah, yeah,
1960, yeah.
a little earlier than that. A little earlier than that. But not by much. So they stayed in that apartment for a long time with different permutations of people, including Monsieur Léon and my grandmother and Lazare and my two cousins, Jean-Pierre and Philip. I didn't mention. They both recently died in their 80s. They remember the phone number as being Atwater 98155, the same thing. At one point, we were both using it as passwords. It was funny. And we were both shocked that we both had the same phone number. So we both knew the same apartment as our childhood apartment, and yet we don't remember each other in it at all because we weren't there at the same time.
So how long were your parents actually married, would you say?
Not more than under 2 years.
And so your parents split up, and what does your father decide to do for your mother?
He sends her, before they separate, he sends her to the south of France. Now, here I get it from my mother, to get to know his culture better. Well, if that's the case, why didn't he send her to Paris, where all the immigrants lived? I mean, he didn't go to the south of France. That makes no sense. So there's something not quite complete about this story. So they're in the south of France. At that time, Ed Morrow, her first husband, is doing some work for the government or something, or maybe reporting, or who knows, in Poland after the war. And so he gets to see his children, comes to visit. My father comes once. I have pictures of that. And I have a series of letters that I often thought to make into some little, I can't quite decide what. It might even be a little play. But based on, I don't know, maybe 8 letters. They're all written within a week of each other. Everybody's writing to everybody else. And they're all basically lying. And it's just quite amazing and wonderful. So there's a letter from Sioma, my father, to my mother. And there's a letter from my mother to her father. She's asking for advice about divorce. And there's a letter from my father to his still sister-in-law, Ed Morrow. No, it's not. He really liked Ed Morrow's sister, Helena Dow. So they're really not related to each other. But the relationship remained one of mutual respect. There's a letter there. And there's a letter from my father to his father-in-law, my grandfather. And there's a letter from Ed Morrow to his sister about his paycheck from the New York Times. And they're all writing at the same time and planning stuff, and it's interesting. Let's put it that way.
Intrigue.
Intrigue. I mean, whatever.
So you're in the south of France. Where are you, on the Riviera?
Yeah. A town called Saint-Jouan-les-Pins, St. John of the Pines. And I think she was having a good time there.
Getting to know French culture.
Getting to know French culture, yeah. And at the time, they pick up a nanny for me there, who is French-speaking only. And so my first language becomes French.
What is her name?
Her name was Marie-Louise Ray, R-E-Y, and I called her Mémé, which is a French expression for an old lady, maybe your grandmother, or, yeah, mémé, M-E, accent aigu, M-E, accent aigu, mé.
You were about a year old or 2 years old. How old is she about?
I'm not sure, maybe 50, maybe 45, yeah. And she stays with me for a nice long time until I'm maybe 7 or 8. Oh, maybe a little less. So from there, Jane goes to, not me, my mother, goes someplace to do this divorce and comes back. I think that's how it must have worked. Someplace in the country where you can get, I don't know, Las Vegas, I have no idea. And she remarries her first husband in the first arrondissement in Paris in 1951. Okay, so 51. So if I'm born in 48, there, I don't remember what date. And no one explained to Lainey that she'd gotten divorced. She couldn't understand how you could be married to two people. Right. So Lainey and Andy get French too. They're sent to French schools, but it doesn't stay with them as a strong dominant language, because the next place we move to is Ed Morrow's assignment is as foreign correspondent for the New York Times in South America, based in Buenos Aires. So I don't remember what everybody else in the family does if they go to America and then to South America. But I go with the nanny to New York to visit my father. And then we show up in Buenos Aires. And my brother has just been to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and he's gone to find the old houses that we lived in. And he actually got into the last one that we all lived in, quite miraculously, knew somebody. I mean, it was like crazy coincidence. Yeah. And got to view the inside of that apartment. I could draw a floor plan for him before he even got there. Yeah. Meanwhile, I've gone back to the 1326 Madison Avenue. I got in there through a bizarre coincidence also. And I've gotten a tour of that apartment. So at this point begins the commuting child. I go back and forth between my mother and my father, from Buenos Aires, Argentina, to New York. And the nanny comes along with me. And I go to visit on some regular basis. Once I'm in school, it's the summer vacation, which turns out to be winter in New York. So for that whole chunk of time, I don't have summer. And that explains why my brother and sister can swim and dive, and I never learned how to do either very well, certainly not dive at all. My loss.
But you learned to skate in Central Park.
Oh yes, I had nice clothes. I have a picture here I've been holding. This is in the 1326 Madison Avenue apartment, and it is you can't see it now. Okay. All these pictures will be available to you in digital albums. And my father is sitting there holding and sort of talking to a dress that he has stuffed with tissue paper. And one of them is on the floor, standing up on its own, and the other one he's holding and talking to. And these were dresses that he would have made for me and sent to Argentina. And I was in this apartment and took a picture of that location. All these old pictures, I took pictures of a modern version of the same spot. Nothing had changed. Well, my father wasn't there. But this is me and my mother. This is sometime before we leave for France. And that's my mother as the graduation from high school. That's me at 18. This is Rachel and Sarah, now called Shatai, and that's Rebecca, Seth's sister, and the two children of Ken. I'll go through all the pictures. And this is the wall that people like this wall, and one of the reasons it works is because it's all in black and white.
This is the Wall of Glory.
No, it's not the Wall of Glory. This is not albums. This is not certificates and diplomas. This is pictures. Here's where you can control these people. I can put my father and mother together, even though I never really experienced them together.
You experienced them together several times in your life later. One time was when you got married.
Yeah, but it wasn't like think of weddings that you go to. There isn't very much interaction. There's a lot of activity around the ceremony, and there's not much to watch.
So here you are in Argentina with your nanny, and you're going to school.
First school I remember is American Community School, and then I'm switched to a French lycée, and in Argentina, and then when I come up to the United States and I go to school, I go to a French lycée also.
Do you remember as a child what some of your favorite toys were or games you played?
I had a magnificent doll that was she must have been 2 feet, maybe even a little more tall. And it was like if you handled her in the right way, her legs would move forward, like she's marching, frankly. And I got her from Cecily and Walter Amesbury. And Cecily made these fabulous clothes for this doll. And I only let go of her when I left the kibbutz. I think I left her there with somebody. I had her. There were other dolls. There was a smaller doll. I can't quite remember her, but she had a lot of clothes and stuff. Yeah. And I remember one year I got as a present from my sister. It was like a scarf or some item, not for me, but for the doll. And I remember being upset because it wasn't a present for me, it was for the doll. I remember that. I remember playing quietly by myself, make-believe, with my fingers tracing the shape of a little welded sculpture, which I now have over there on the windowsill. And it needs some welding again. It stood on a particular bookcase, which I actually think I also have. And in case you're wondering where it is, Ken, or if somebody else is wondering where it is. Oh, this needs help. This piece needs help. Here it is. It's got these little ladder things. It's like a world. Needs a little welding.
Somehow it reminds me of a Magritte.
Well, whatever it is, it was part of my early childhood. And Lainey had it, and she gave it to Clay. And then when Clay heard that it had been an early memory of mine like that, he sent it to me.
Graciously.
Very lovely. We had a dog too. Dog's name was Petit. And
This is down in Argentina?
Yeah. We didn't have it in the last house we lived in. We had it someplace in between. We have established with my brother discussing this that we had it in 2 different houses. We lived in 4 different places.
When you were a child in Argentina, did you have chores to do, or did you have servants take care of everything? Where did you learn the concept of chores, and where did you do them?
I didn't do chores until we moved back to the United States. The nanny disappeared at one point, and I started making these trips back and forth by myself. They were long trips. They were like 30-hour trips.
Like a milk train.
Yeah, stopping at every capital along the way. Lima, Peru. Quito, Ecuador.
Caracas, Venezuela, whatever. Yeah.
No, not Venezuela, wrong side. It would go up the west coast of South America, and then it would land in Florida, where my father would meet me in Miami.
You'd see him on the portico?
Yeah, I would watch for his outline on the roof line of the airport. In those days, security wasn't such an issue and everything was smaller. And then from there, we would fly to New York. And there I would meet there was a cousin named Borenstein we met in Florida. And maybe he did some business with some of the department stores in Miami. I remember dragging around to see people I didn't know, that I don't register in any particular way, but I had a real distinct sense of what Miami Beach looks like. And it was like Miami Beach. I mean, when you think of Miami Beach now, these whole hotels that are lit up in turquoise and weird colors, and it was not some place that I ever wanted to go back to.
Just as an aside, how were you dressed down in Argentina? What kind of clothes you wore? Did you choose them? And when you came to live with your father, did he attire you? Was he dressing you and getting clothes for you? Or did you pick out your own clothes?
Oh, I never picked out my own clothes. In fact, no one taught me, just like no one taught me how to do anything, I had to figure it out myself. No one taught me how to shop. It was really, I remember how hard it was to learn how to shop and how careful I was, because I'd made some mistakes that cost me some money at the beginning. I wanted something badly and I didn't. I was always cautious because I knew about how clothes are made, and a lot of the stuff you would see in stores was really shabbily made. So, does it matter? Well, it took me a while to figure out that a lot of it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm not going to the ball. I'm just wearing this skirt or whatever it is to classes. I mean, so my sense of what's the right outfit and what's the right thing to buy was something I had to learn. I realized how not obvious it was.
What were you like as a child? How were you different from your period as a child from how you are now? Well, let's start with, how would you describe yourself as a child, either in Argentina or when you came back to New Jersey and New York? What were you like?
Well, recently I read a little story that somebody wrote for my 50th, the same as Cecily and Walter Amesbury, who bought me that doll, they had written a little book for me. He illustrated it and she wrote it. And ostensibly the topic was what to buy Janie Peach Blossom for her birthday. What they ended up buying me was bizarre beyond belief and doesn't actually show up in the story itself. But my father had it bound for me. And this is in 1957. These are, I want to show you one particular story, one particular drawing. So there's this star that's telling Cecily what to get for this little girl because the star is spying on the child.
Can you hold it up straight?
And this is my father. And you'll notice that he has cuffs. He's a stick figure. Everybody's a stick figure. but he has cuffs, like, cufflinks, but for the sake of the point that the illustrator's trying to make, it's okay, we'll show it some other time.
Okay.
He's got his glasses. This is a bed, a very decorative bed that I had in the Fifth Avenue apartment. So that means in 57 we lived in that
Is
apartment.
this going to give you clues what you were like as a child?
They did another one for me when I was 50. We got in touch again. And they described me on a visit that I made to their house as somebody that I don't recognize at all. Lively, vivacious, with gumption, a little bit of a risk taker, and wanting to stay with them and tricking my father so that I could stay with them. He's off at the elevator and I run back into their house. I saw a little girl that I didn't recognize at all. I thought of myself as a watcher,
An observer.
an observer. I thought of myself as shy. I think I was frightened. I didn't quite understand how things worked. I was changing cultures and languages on a regular basis. I was the last child. No one was particularly paying attention to me. There was the stepfather, there was the father. The father was distant. I mean, not personality, but he lived far away. The link was the nanny. The only permanent fixture was the nanny. And I'd always feeling changing schools, changing places, always being a foreigner,
An outsider.
always an outsider. I was the only one with a different last name in my mother's house. They're all called Morrow. I'm called Trigère. And later I would notice that I'm not in the photo albums of the Trigères, or very rarely, because I only come to visit for 2-3 months of the year. So I don't have a real relationship with my Bradley cousins. First of all, they're 14 and 17 years older than I am. So we never intersect in the same place at the same time. So I'm very much alone. I think that colors a lot of the way I deal with the rest of the world. I'm watching for people who are stranded, who feel alone, who might feel alone, who are strangers. I reach out. I also was different from everybody I knew. I spoke 3 languages. I remember my Virginia grandfather asking me one day, rather ceremoniously, "So Janie, what languages do you speak?" And I say, translating from the French, I said, "It depends what village I'm in." I'm translating ville into what I think of as the proper word in English, village. What I'm meaning to say is what city I'm in. Depends what village I'm in. If I'm in Paris, I speak French, If I'm in New York, I speak English. If I'm in Buenos Aires, I speak Spanish. How many kids do you know who can do that? Or who that's actually true for? So when I landed in New Jersey, when we came back to the United States, we landed in New Jersey. Ed Morrow, still working for the New York Times. We land in Middle America, New Jersey. And I see my mother, who was always entertaining and had cocktail parties, and the people we would see at these parties were wearing saris and turbans and togas, and you had the international set.
Exotic.
And it was exotic, right? And suddenly we're in Middle America and she's wearing Bermuda shorts. That was a little mind twist. It was like, huh? And we're shopping for a lawnmower at Sears. Whereas we had servants down there. We didn't in New Jersey. My father always had somebody cleaning house. But I always loved helping her shine silver. But I knew to leave my bed made. You know, I wasn't, well, I guess I was spoiled, but I wasn't, you asked me about chores before. In New Jersey, we were assigned chores. That was the first time I'd experienced that.
You were an outsider. Would you say also that
Oh, I went to a school in New Jersey, and the public school I went to, 4th grade, Miss Yost, and I only remember this story because my mother repeated it so often to other people. There are a lot of stories, of course, that are like that. And Miss Jost is talking to my mother saying, but don't you want her to write like an American? They were talking about my handwriting, obviously. And my mother's saying, I don't see any reason why that's important. You know, people's nationalities, people write differently in different cultures. It's something that's, the handwriting. You know, you can look and say, oh, that's a Frenchman writing, that's an American writing. And then I landed in this private school. My father must not have been happy with the school I was in, so he said, put her in a better school. So I was in this private school, day school, Rumson Country Day School. And boy, was I different. And I remember there was a father of a girl who became a good friend of mine, Debbie Beardsley's father. He was so kind to me. He spoke to me in French. I mean, even to think about it now makes me want to cry. That was such a nice gesture, because I was such a fish out of water. And to see somebody among all these Americans who could come and meet me where I was.
Who took an interest.
Who took an interest in this little girl who spoke French and Spanish. He did French, and he spoke to me in French.
Didn't you tell me about a teacher once, when you read a poem was read, and the teacher said, I thought, Jane, you would like this poem. Wasn't there a
Well,
story?
that's not quite related to any of this. That's more like the luck you will have if you have a good teacher who reaches out to anybody, right? This was not a bilingual issue. It was my English teacher at the Lycée Français in New York, Mrs. Hess. Yeah. And she brought a poem one day, and I started reading it out loud. Abu Ben Adam, may his tribe increase, awoke one night from a deep dream of peace. And I'm reading it out loud as she's handing it out, and she said, I thought you'd like that one, Jane. Or maybe Janie. And to have a teacher tell you that sentence means somebody is thinking about you outside of when they're seeing you in class. That you are on, you register in their mind at some other time. I think that's a gift.
So you're going back and forth, different cultures, different ways of life. Can you tell us more about Jane Ellis Morrow, what she was like as a person
And as a parent.
and as a parent? How,
So
what
I
was she
think,
like?
so what happens is that she comes to New Jersey, and remember, she still never got her BA. She's never had a profession. She's never worked, except for that job at the Wool Bureau. And she's extremely bright. And she doesn't have a raison d'être, a reason, she doesn't have a profession. She's of the generation of
Gloria Steinem?
a little older, who was the one before?
Betty Friedan?
Betty Friedan. If she'd finished, she could have been teaching. She might have gotten a PhD. She might have been a professor. She might have been a rabble-rouser in the early women's movement. But instead, she had babies, and she was stuck. And that's what happens. And she didn't have the connections that you get when you actually finish school at some school. And the better the school, the better the connections you're going to make. They're going to be useful to you, climbing whatever ladder it is you're looking to climb. And so around the time I went to live with my father, which was, I think, 12 or 13, she decided to go back and finish her degree at Columbia General Studies. She got her BA and she got her master's in English. And I'm really proud of her for doing that. She was a smoker. This is a person, an alcohol drinker, but so was Ed Morrow. If you look at movies from the 50s, everybody was drinking.
Part of the culture.
It's
hard
really
drinking. He's also a reporter.
Yes. Yeah, so he was a hard drinker, and part of that world of that time was drinking. This was that culture. And I think she was not really happy. She had no voice of her own, and she was one powerful personality who had no outlets. I remember her stuck watching TV, smoking her cigarette, her Raleigh cigarettes, watching.
Finishing the New York Times crossword puzzle.
Oh yes, she would do the crossword puzzle. All my life I remember her doing that, always in pen. It was daunting, and I always avoided it. I only recently started doing crossword puzzles, and I realized that if you're immersed in a certain culture, as she was, American, English culture, elevated, educated, you can keep doing the New York Times crossword puzzle because that's the world you know. And all the cues, the clues, and the responses will be within what you know. If you do the recorder from Greenfield, you'll notice that it's very repetitious. I think they all are repetitious, by the way. But it's a whole different culture, a whole different level of intellect, and you can do it in 5 minutes. You move up to the next, another newspaper, and suddenly you've got somebody else's brain to learn by heart. I didn't understand that. I thought that it was just intelligence, but it's a cultural I guess you could say that which crossword puzzle you can do in a snap identifies which piece of the American culture you belong to. She was a bit harsh. It's suddenly like, here we were in New Jersey, and suddenly she's having to tell me to do my chores. This was not something we'd done in Argentina. The person who was in charge of me most of the time was the nanny. And her life was very different. I think she was angry, upset, I don't know about resentful, but like pissed off that she'd missed the boat. And here she was in suburbia, mowing the lawn, and having children who, well, our brother was gone before we came back. He'd gone off already to college and elsewhere. So she's got Lainey, who's in high school. She's not particularly kind to Lainey. She's better with me. And there are reasons. I mean, are there reasons? I don't know. But she and I have a different relationship to the same person. And she's a really hands-off kind of person. She drives me to school. She's part of a carpool. But we've never entertained any of the other families from the school that I go to at our house, nor have I ever seen them at my mother and stepfather at any of these other houses. So there's, again, this isolation piece. And I think she's miserable. I think she's frankly miserable. So she goes back, so she's drinking and she's smoking. She goes back to college. I think that must have been some of the happiest times in her life. She gets an apartment up on the west side someplace. So she separates for a while. It's not a separation, but in de facto is, from Ed, who's still going back and forth from New Jersey to Times Square. And she gets this apartment. Maybe he stays with her sometimes, I don't know. And she finishes school in, I don't know what amount of time, but I'm in high school at the same
Goes
time.
to Columbia.
Yeah, I actually showed up once at one of her classes. And she finishes and gets her degree. I wish I'd come to the graduation. I would have been proud to do that. It occurs to me just now, how come there was no party for her that I remember? And then she looks for a job. It wasn't easy.
She got a master's too.
She got a master's. It wasn't easy to get a job if you were 25. And here she was in her 50s. I don't know what exactly. And the job she finds is at Grambling College in Grambling, Louisiana. This is a black college that's known mostly for its football team. And she and I, it's the only thing we ever did this way. We drove down together. It must have been her idea. I'm thrilled that I did this with her. It's the only opportunity I had to be alone and on the road and out of any former context with her. We drove, she drove, I didn't drive, all the way to Grambling, through the Blue Ridge Mountains, through Kentucky, through places I would go out to get instructions on the next directions, and I'd come back to the car and I'd say I didn't understand a word he said. And we must have stayed in motels along the way. I remember very little. And when we got there, I spent a week with her there, a week, 10 days. And then she flew me back to go to my first, to freshman year, Sarah Lawrence College. It was an eye-opening experience. It was my first experience of being a minority among blacks. The whole town is black. And I had a wonderful time. People were really lovely, and I was learning to dance dances I hadn't done, and hanging out with people that I wouldn't normally hang out with. And one day I was in the cafeteria, the football team, it was before school started, they were there already, getting ready for the games. And I go up to one of the machines that sell Coke or I don't know what, and they're all chrome and mirror. And I come up, and there's a mirror or something, and I see this. I do a double take at the face that's looking at me. It's this pale face. It's me. But I'd spent the week looking at black faces. And I really understood it in that instant, what it's like to be black in America, where everything around you is white. There were no blacks in magazines. There were no blacks on TV. There were no advertisement had blacks in them. My family, my father and aunt, hired the first black runway model. There were people who would not come to the shows because there was a black woman showing our clothes. I'm proud that they were the first to do that. Her name was Beverly Valdez, Valdez. And I think she's still around, actually. And I went back to Sarah Lawrence, the world that was mostly white.
And what happened to your mother at Grambling?
She lasted not too long. She and a few other teachers helped a bunch of students who went on strike. They wanted to have more emphasis on academics and less on sports. And those students got kicked out, but not before the teachers' union found them places in the best colleges of America. They all went off to great schools, and the 2-3 teachers got fired.
The ones who supported the students.
The ones who supported the students.
And your mother was teaching English literature there?
Yeah. And then she went off to teach in Hazard, Kentucky, and that was an experience. By that time, I'm married to Larry, and we go down to visit her. It was not a successful visit, but I was always making the effort to go back and visit with her. Repeatedly, always. And Yeah, she just did not have enough of the conventional rewards of life.
Hazard, Kentucky was a coal mining town?
Yeah, yeah. So community college there. And then she finally got a really good job in a reasonable location in New Jersey at Brookdale Community College. She taught English there. So she's now near home. And
Ed dies in the meantime, doesn't he?
yeah, I'm trying to figure out when that happens exactly. Because she comes back from Hazard and he's just died. So it has to be after so the Brookdale stuff is after he's died. And that was the place she could have shined. Except at this point she starts having something wrong with her throat. She's got some throat operations she has to do. She can't talk. She can't lecture and talk in a class. See, I thought that was a really
Tragic.
cruel ending to a budding career. And then she dies young at 63.
But how does she meet the commander? The
I don't
Commodore?
remember.
She gets married to the Commodore, though.
Yeah, retired
Admiral.
rear admiral.
His name was?
Andrew Shepard. So oddly enough, many of the grandchildren, Laney's children, think of her as Grandma Shepard, which to me is so bizarre. It's like meaningless. I don't know why people, this is a certain American Protestant culture that names the grandmothers by their last names. Grandma Shepard?
And she died living in a retirement community near Laney. Laney was taking care of her, right?
She was with the commander, yeah.
In a retirement community near Laney in Southbury, Kentucky.
Yeah, that was a good ending for Laney and my mother, because although she saw Laney as very successful and
Head of visiting
appreciated
nurses.
by her community, head of the prominent visiting nurse association, and Laney was the go-to person who was watching out for her needs and stuff. So there was a poetic ending in that.
Can we get back a moment to yourself when you were growing up? Did you get into any trouble at all when you were a kid or a teenager? Or would you just describe yourself as going with the flow and never rebelling or having trouble?
What an interesting question. Is that question from Shatai?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Shatai, by the way, just to keep things straight, Sarah is my first child. Sarah Cecilia, named after Larry's grandmother and my grandmother, and also my mother's sister who died young, Sarah. And she changed her name when she was 16. She changed it to Zoe, and then she legally changed it to Zoe. And how she got to Zoe was she didn't like Sarah when she was a kid in Israel. It was an old lady's name. It's like being called Mildred or Shirley. And she said to me one day, "What were you going to call me if you hadn't called me Sarah?" And I said, "Actually, I was thinking of Zoe." Zoe, it was a very uncommon name. No one was called Zoe in those days. Now everybody and their dog is called Zoe. But it became like overpopular. But at that time, nobody was. And I'd gotten the name from a French author named Zoe Oldenburg. I just thought it was an elegant name, and it was Zoe with an umlaut on the O. And she said, "What does that mean? That's ugly." I said, "It means life in Greek." And so I said, "If you don't like it, don't worry, it's not your name. No. So that got dropped, but at 16 she met somebody named Zoe and she adopted the name. And we just moved back to the States and she forced everybody to go from calling her Sarah for about 2 months to switching to Zoe. And she successfully did it. And she kept it up and she went back to do the army in Israel and she had everybody call her Zoe. And then in Israel, I think, she actually legally changed her name to Zoe. I think she did Zoe Sarah. I think she dropped the Cecile. Yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, then later on in her 30s in America, she changed her name again to Shatai. Illegally changed her name. But not only that, she also changed her last name. She'd been married to a guy named Oren Moshe. So she was Zoe Moshe, and now she was Shatai Moshe, and then she became Shatai Treasure. We've never discussed it at great length. It's an interesting choice. It's not a bad choice, it's my name, but it's not the usual pattern of development of names. So this one, she's asking me this question, so I'm thinking, knowing the source of the question, the source of who the questioner is, makes it more interesting, frankly. You know, it's my own daughter, right? I didn't do the kinds of things you did, honey. I don't think, unless you call getting married young a risk. In that sense, yes, I was a risk taker. I didn't do drugs. I never smoked. Not alcohol. I remember freshman year I tried Southern Comfort as a drink. It wasn't for me. I must have done 1 month of trying that out. I, in fact, even tried smoking, but I'm thinking, what am I doing? I'm an asthmatic. This is ridiculous. And how do you turn the pages of your book and hold a cigarette at the same time? So that was an experiment that was very short-lived, maybe a month. And I must have smoked in my lifetime 4 marijuana cigarettes.
But you didn't inhale.
I inhaled. But that's it. And I think all of them, maybe not all of them, maybe some of them were with Larry. So I didn't do any of those traditional things. I guess having intimate relationships with a boyfriend at age 16 might have been considered a risky behavior. That was in France, the summer I was 16. And again, getting married at 19, that's kind of odd. But no, I was probably just a good girl.
You led a pretty conventional woman's life for your time also, like your mother at that point.
No, I did one thing that was unconventional. Well, I don't know how unconventional. It was for me unconventional. I was living with my father in our apartment on Fifth Avenue on the summer after my freshman year. And I was working downtown on 7th Avenue at Jerry Silverman's.
Clothing business.
Yeah. And I had an argument with my father, which I don't recall at all. Or with Gun, probably with my father. And I moved out. Yeah, I moved out, and I moved in with my boyfriend, who was Larry Bessman. It had to be then, because after my sophomore year, we were married. So it had to be the summer between my freshman and sophomore year. And I moved in with him in an apartment that he was house-sitting, some professor's apartment on the Upper West Side right near Columbia. And he was working, running playgrounds for Ed Solomon in this Morningside Heights community organization, whatever it was. And he was 3 years older than I was.
So you really didn't argue with your father very much?
Well, I'd have to discuss this with Gun, because clearly I had some argument for me to storm out.
At that time. But generally, your father, from what I gather, was a very demanding, tough disciplinarian, so to speak, who had great expectations of your behavior and how you were to be as a person. Is that correct?
Well,
Wouldn't
yeah,
there be-
he had expectations of me doing my homework and of what I was wearing and how I should behave in public. But so I remember having an argument with him that I won, basically. I had a circle skirt, silk, beautiful circle skirt, and I had two of them actually. And somebody was coming for dinner, and I was wearing that skirt, and I chose to put it with a petticoat underneath, which is not made for that. Okay, so speaking aesthetically, the beauty of the circle skirt and the fabric that it's made of is that it swings beautifully, and there's a lot of fabric that allows it to freely swing in just a beautiful way. You put a petticoat under it, it lifts it up in a silly way. It's like the top of some poof pastry. It's not made for that. But I was 12, 13.
Experimenting.
I wanted that petticoat, and I never left my room because he told me that I shouldn't wear it, and I wanted to wear it. So I didn't show up at dinner. So I see a strength of character there. I can hold my own. I mean, the topic may not be very important, but the principle was.
What I was also referring to was that your father observed you very carefully, your behavior, how you presented yourself in public.
Yeah, I was highly judged.
And he would
But it's not like he was like a pre-Freudian human being. It's not like he would sit down and say, why are you thinking of doing this? Or, I want to talk to you about this, and let's talk. There was none of that. There was no conversing with me and finding out what I thought about anything. It's actually not that uncommon. I mean, did anybody do that with you? No, right.
He didn't want to find out what made you who you are and what made you
He
unique.
had no interest in that.
He would submit these documents that you would find every morning,
No.
instructing you.
He would, yeah, this was cruel. I would come and I wake up in the morning, and on my toilet seat, I had my own bathroom, on the toilet seat in my bathroom, he had left a 10-page letter. Now, admittedly, it's not 10 full pages. He might write 6 lines on each page. But 10 pages telling me what I did wrong and how I spoke to my aunt the other day. It was, and when I went off to college, I would still get these letters. And my roommate, Paula Jackson, said to me, "Why are you keeping them? Why are you rehearsing the pain?" She may not have used that phrase then, but why are you keeping them? And I threw them out. And I'm glad I threw them out, but now I would like to see them again, to really try to see if I could understand this man. And what I understood eventually is that in his world, he didn't expect me. I was purely an extension of him. And he was hardest not on me, but on himself. And so he had probably a tremendous amount of self-criticism, not to say self-loathing. I don't know. But some message had gone to him from someplace, maybe that grandfather, that father of his, and he was just doing the only thing he knew how to do. And he was passing on to me and to anybody associated with him, frankly.
Including
His wife
including
Jane.
including his wives, including his
Gordon.
sister, including, he had standards that he pushed people to that were not always reasonable. And I really, to be understanding and compassionate, I think he was probably hardest on himself.
Who were some of your, tell me about your teacher in the lycée who you remember fondly, your instructor in movement.
Oh, Maya Ellis.
Yeah, probably your favorite teacher. Let's end on that note for tonight. Tell me about Maya.
Yeah, she came to, not to the wedding, but to the wedding party. She was invited. She was a blithe spirit. She was floating above everything in a strange kind of way. She was the movement teacher. She was the teacher for what amounted to gym for the girls at the Lycée Français in New York. The boys would go out to the park to play soccer, and we would do pas de deux and sort of ballet routines diagonally across the ballroom, and then we did floor mat exercises. Well, what they turned out to be were the exercises that she learned from her mother, a whole technique, a whole system. And they were sort of pre-Pilates, or maybe from the same period. But years later, I realized that I knew exercises that other people were talking about as if they were something very special from some system. And I think, but I do this normally. And I learned them from her. And she had come, she had an interesting background. Her father was a Russian Jewish pianist and composer from St. Petersburg from the 1910 or something like that period. And her mother was a non-Jewish dancer, movement person. And they ended up in Paris. And the mother taught at some studio of hers on the Champs-Élysées, and her students were all these wealthy women from, I don't know what.
It's a period of Isadora Duncan.
The period of Isadora Duncan, right. And they also traveled around the world, he as a concert pianist, and they left their two or three daughters with friends immersed in ballet classes. And then the parents went to Israel together, and I think split up, and the mother went back to Paris, and the father stayed in Israel. He had changed his name from something I can't remember that sounds very Russian Jewish to I think the first name was Aryeh, but I'm not positive anymore. Abileah, which means father of Leah, and that was her Hebrew name. If she could say she had a Hebrew name, I mean, she had no Jewish upbringing or any kind, and her name was Maya, so I'm not quite sure how that.
But she spoke Hebrew since she lived.
Oh, she lived in Israel and she spoke Hebrew. So Maya was in Israel. She fell in love with Bezalel Schatz, the son of the founder of the art school in Israel, in Jerusalem, Boris Schatz. And Bezalel was a painter, and he was going off to New York, and she followed him. And they broke up, and there's a beautiful, in her apartment, there was a beautiful portrait of Maya. Maya invited me to her house once, which is a little unusual. I was with another student, and I remember coming into this small apartment, and on a wall facing the bathroom and maybe a closet, I'm not sure what, was a large fabric on the wall. And on the fabric, she had pinned all her jewelry. I thought that was so clever. And I admired a particular pin that just like, wow, it was so beautiful. It was a large bug of some kind in brass, simple. And she just took it off and she gave it to me. I still have it. I always get compliments when I wear it. And I wore it to her memorial. She died, I think, at age nearly 100. And I told my stories about her.
You had the
And
pleasure.
she stayed a friend. She was invited to my first wedding. She said, she reminded me one time, she said, I spent a lot of money going to buy you, it was a lot of my income to go buy you a wedding gift. I'm thinking, why tell me this and why did you do that? Who asked you to do that? But I didn't say any of those things. But she did, which was a little unusual. She never did things like that. But she was a little upset that that silver salt and pepper shaker had stayed with Larry when I moved to the kibbutz. I had to explain to her that I had no use for silver salt and pepper shaker on a kibbutz. I don't know that he had any use for it either, but we remained friends. When I came back from Israel, I got in touch with her, and we visit. And
She came up here and taught.
yeah, I invited her up to give a talk about her work here. Yeah.
And she had a wealth of friends from all over the world. She
All over
gathered
the world.
friends.
She was a little bit like me. She spoke a whole bunch of different languages, and she goes up to strangers and offers kindnesses. And people were talking about this at her memorial service, and I turned to you, Ken, and I said, oh my goodness, she had an influence on me that I never knew. I do the same thing.
Acts of loving kindness. People,
And
strangers.
reaching out in a language that the person knows to somebody who is a stranger and helping them out. And I hope that I will be known and remembered for those acts too.